April 16, 1945. Classified Field Report, Soviet 3rd Shock Army Intelligence Division. Asterisk. Asterisk, the Reich Chancellery burns tonight. Through the smoke and ash, we can see the enemy's final stronghold crumbling like a house of cards. But this is not victory, this is apocalypse. Berlin is not a city anymore. It is a furnace where the Third Reich comes to die, and where boys with Hitler Youth armbands fight tanks with Panzerfausts because there is nothing left but the madness of desperate men. The morning air tasted of cordite and burning flesh when Senior Lieutenant Alexei Volkov pressed his face against the shattered window of what had once been a Berlin bakery. Outside, the Unter den Linden Boulevard, Hitler's Grand Ceremonial Avenue, had become a graveyard of twisted metal and broken dreams. Soviet IS, 2 heavy tanks rumbled through the rubble like mechanical predators, their 122mm guns swiveling to target the remnants of German resistance. Behind them, infantrymen of the 3rd Shock Army advanced in practiced formations, their PP-41 submachine guns ready, their faces hard as the concrete beneath their boots. But it was the silence between the explosions that unsettled Volkov most. In those brief moments, he could hear children crying in basement shelters, could smell the fear seeping from every broken building. This wasn't just the fall of a city, it was the death of an entire world order. Across the street, a Tiger II tank sat motionless, smoke pouring from its engine compartment. Its crew had abandoned it hours ago, leaving behind only the ghostly echo of the Wehrmacht's former might. What happened in those final 16 days would reshape the world forever. But the real story isn't found in the history books. It's buried in the rubble, written in blood and carved into the souls of those who witnessed the end of everything. April 14, 1945, 2 days before the assault. Lieutenant Colonel Heinrich Weber stood on the observation deck of the Berlin Flak Tower, watching the city prepare for its final battle. Below him, the once proud capital of the Third Reich stretched out like a patient on an operating table, wounded, exposed, and waiting for the surgeon's knife. Weber was 43 years old, a veteran of campaigns in Poland, France, and the early days of Barbarossa. He had believed in the 1,000-year Reich once. Now he believed only in protecting the civilians huddled in the bunkers beneath his feet. Herr Oberst, his aide, a boy named Klaus who couldn't have been older than 17, approached with a clipboard. "The ammunition count you requested." Weber took the report without looking at it. He already knew what it said: not enough. Never enough. The Wehrmacht had 45,000 men to defend Berlin against 1.5 million Soviet and Polish troops. It was mathematics, and mathematics didn't lie. "Klaus," Weber said quietly, "do you have family in the city?" "Yes, sir. My mother and sister. They're in the Anhalter Bahnhof bunker." Weber nodded. The old railway station had been converted into one of the largest air raid shelters. It housed nearly 12,000 civilians, women, children, elderly men who remembered the Kaiser's Germany. They were all Hitler's final victory now. Through his binoculars, Weber could see them, Soviet Ilyushin A-2 Sturmovix, flying low over the city's eastern suburbs. The flying tanks, as German soldiers called them, were conducting reconnaissance, photographing defensive positions, preparing for the storm to come. In 48 hours, the largest artillery barrage in military history would begin. But Weber didn't need to wait for the guns to know that Berlin was already lost. He could see it in the eyes of his men, smell it in the smoke that never quite cleared from the air, feel it in the way the city seemed to hold its breath. Chapter 2: The Thunder of Gods. April 16, 1945 to 0500 hours. The world ended at exactly 5 o'clock in the morning. Marshal Georgy Zhukov had assembled 22,000 artillery pieces along the Oder River, more concentrated firepower than had ever been unleashed in human history. When they opened fire simultaneously, the sound could be heard 100 kilometers away. Senior Lieutenant Alexei Volkov felt the earth shake beneath his feet as shells the size of telephone poles screamed overhead. He was part of the 79th Guards Rifle Division, veterans of Stalingrad and Kursk, men who had fought their way from the Volga to the gates of Berlin. "This is for Leningrad," shouted Sergeant Major Ivan Petrov, a scarred giant from the Siberian forests whose entire family had died during the 872-day siege. "This is for Stalingrad," echoed Corporal Dmitry Kozlov, still carrying shrapnel in his left shoulder from the grain elevator battles. But for Volkov, this was simply mathematics. 2 million Soviet casualties in the race to Berlin. 27 million Soviet dead since 1941. The arithmetic of revenge was finally coming due. The preliminary bombardment lasted exactly 30 minutes. When it ended, the silence was more deafening than the noise had been. Then came the infantry, wave after wave of Soviet soldiers, their battle cries echoing across the blasted landscape of Berlin's eastern suburbs. Chapter 3: The Hitler Youth's Last Stand. Meanwhile, in Sector Z9 near Tempelhof Airfield, 16-year-old Franz Müller crouched behind the wreckage of a Luftwaffe fighter, his hands trembling as he tried to load a Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon. 3 weeks ago, he had been studying for his university entrance exams. Now he was Germany's last line of defense. "Remember," whispered his squad leader, a boy named Hans who was barely 18 himself, "aim for the track assemblies. One shot then move. Don't try to be heroes." Franz wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. Heroes? They were children with weapons designed for grown men, tasked with stopping the most powerful army in the world. The Hitler Youth had been told they were the future of Germany. As it turned out, they were also its end. Through the smoke, he could see them, Soviet T-34-85 tanks, their sloped armor gleaming dully in the morning light. Behind them came the infantry, hundreds of soldiers in brown uniforms, their weapons ready, their faces grim with purpose. Franz had never killed anyone. His father had died at Normandy, his older brother at Kursk. His mother was somewhere in the city, probably in a bunker, praying for his safety. He thought of her now as he raised the Panzerfaust to his shoulder. The mathematics were simple: 1 shot, maybe 2 if he was lucky, then death. But at 16, death felt like an abstract concept, something that happened to other people. He pulled the trigger. Chapter 4: Street by Street. April 20th, 1945. Hitler's 56th birthday. The Führerbunker lay 50 feet beneath the Reich Chancellery, a concrete tomb where the architect of Europe's destruction spent his final days raging against a world that no longer obeyed his will. Above ground, Berlin burned with the fever of its own destruction. Lieutenant Colonel Weber had moved his command post 3 times in 4 days, each time falling back toward the city center as Soviet forces advanced block by bloody block. Urban warfare was the most brutal kind of fighting, personal, intimate, unforgiving. "Sir," Klaus reported, his uniform torn and dirty, "the 352nd has lost contact with regiment. Soviet armor has broken through at Alexanderplatz." Weber studied his map, marking positions with a red pencil. The pocket of German resistance was shrinking hourly. Soon, there would be nowhere left to retreat to. Outside, he could hear the distinctive sound of Katyusha rockets, Stalin's organs, screaming overhead. The multiple rocket launchers were devastating against infantry in open ground, but in the close confines of city fighting, they served mostly to terrorize. Building collapses nearby. "Klaus," Weber said, "I want you to take a message to the civilian shelters. Tell them to prepare white flags. This madness has to end." "But sir, the Führer's orders." "The Führer is 50 feet underground, boy. We're up here watching Berlin die. Someone has to care more about the living than the dead." Chapter 5: The Reichstag. April 28, 1945. The Reichstag building stood like a wounded giant against the smoke-filled sky, its once proud dome shattered by years of bombing. For the Soviets, it represented more than just another military objective. It was the symbol of German democracy that Hitler had destroyed, and now it would be where the Soviet flag would fly over the conquered Reich. Senior Sergeant Mikhail Yegorov and Junior Sergeant Nurse Katarina had carried the red banner through the ruins of half of Eastern Europe. Now, they stood at the base of the Parliament building, staring up at its scarred walls. "Comrade," Yegorov said to his companion, "do you think our children will believe us when we tell them about this?" Katarina, a Georgian like Stalin himself, spat into the rubble. "If we live to have children." The assault on the Reichstag was led by the 150th Rifle Division, veteran troops who had fought from Stalingrad to Berlin. They faced approximately 5,000 German defenders, Wehrmacht regulars, SS fanatics, Hitler Youth, and foreign volunteers who had chosen to die rather than surrender. Machine gun fire erupts. The fighting was room to room, floor to floor, staircase to staircase. German MG-42 machine guns, with their terrifying rate of fire, turned every corridor into a death trap. Soviet soldiers advanced with grenades and flamethrowers, clearing each position with methodical brutality. In the basement, terrified civilians huddled together. German secretaries, foreign workers, anyone who had sought shelter in what they thought would be the safest building in Berlin. War, they discovered, recognized no sanctuary. Chapter 6. The Bunker's Final Hours. April 30th, 1945 to 15:30 hours. 50 feet below the burning city, Adolf Hitler said goodbye to his staff with the mechanical precision of a man who had already died inside. The Führer bunker was no longer a command center. It was a mausoleum, and everyone in it was already a ghost. General Wilhelm Keitel, once the mighty chief of the Wehrmacht High Command, sat in the corner like a broken mannequin. His uniform, once perfectly pressed, was rumpled and stained. His eyes, which had once burned with fanatical devotion, were empty. "Mein Führer," he whispered, "the situation reports from the city?" But Hitler was no longer listening to situation reports. He was listening to the sound of Soviet artillery, getting closer every hour, measuring the distance to his grave in the frequency of explosions. Eva Braun, now Eva Hitler after their brief wedding ceremony, sat beside him with the calm of someone who had accepted fate. She had chosen love over life, loyalty over survival. History would remember her choice, though it would struggle to understand it. At 3:30 p.m., as Soviet forces were fighting for control of the Reichstag's upper floors, Adolf Hitler put a pistol to his right temple and pulled the trigger. Eva bit down on a cyanide capsule. The Third Reich, which was promised to last 1,000 years, died with them. Above ground, the city continued to burn, unaware that its architect of destruction had finally destroyed himself. Chapter 7. The Banner over Berlin. May 1st, 1945 to 22:50 hours. The red flag of the Soviet Union flew over the Reichstag as the last pockets of German resistance finally surrendered. Senior Sergeant Yegorov and Junior Sergeant Katarina had climbed through hell to plant it there, and photographer Yevgeny Koldyai had captured the moment for history. But for Senior Lieutenant Volkov, standing in the ruins of Unter den Linden, victory felt strangely hollow. Around him, Berlin smoldered like a vast funeral pyre. The smell of death hung over everything, not just the recent dead, but the death of an entire era. His division had started the war with 12,000 men. Fewer than 800 remained. They were the survivors, the lucky ones, the men who would go home to tell the story. But what story would they tell? "Comrade Lieutenant," Sergeant Petrov approached, his massive frame silhouetted against the burning city. "What do we do now?" It was a good question. They had spent 4 years learning how to destroy. Now they would have to remember how to build. If you're still here, you're one of the few who seek the untold truths of war, so hit subscribe and never miss what history tried to bury. Chapter 8. The Civilians' War. Throughout the battle, in the bunkers beneath Berlin, Greta Hoffmann huddled in the Anhalter Bahnhof shelter with her 2 children, listening to the sounds of her world ending above. She was a widow. Her husband had died at Stalingrad 3 years earlier. Her eldest son was somewhere on the Eastern Front, if he was still alive. All she had left were her daughter Maria, age 8, and her son Peter, age 6. "Mama," Maria whispered, "when will it be quiet again?" Greta didn't know how to answer. For the children in the shelter, this was normal. The sound of artillery, the smell of smoke, the taste of fear in the air. They had never known peace. Around them, 12,000 other civilians waited in the darkness. Old men who remembered the Kaiser. Women whose husbands and sons were dead or missing. Children who had learned to distinguish between the sounds of different artillery shells. They were the forgotten casualties of the war, not soldiers who had chosen to fight, but ordinary people caught in the machinery of history. Their stories would be buried beneath the grand narratives of generals and politicians, but their suffering was no less real. When they finally emerged from the bunkers on May 2nd, they found a city that no longer existed. The Berlin they had known, the city of cafes and theaters, of Sunday walks and Christmas markets, was gone forever. In its place was a landscape of rubble and ruins, a cemetery of stone and steel. Chapter 10. The Reckoning. Years later, when the rubble had been cleared and the city rebuilt, the truth about Berlin's fall would be complicated by politics, mythology, and the passage of time. Soviet historians would emphasize the heroism of their soldiers and the justice of their cause. German historians would focus on the suffering of civilians and the futility of continued resistance. But for those who lived through it, the truth was simpler and more complex. War was not about good versus evil, heroes versus villains. It was about ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances, making choices that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Heinrich Weber survived the war and became a teacher in West Berlin, spending the rest of his life trying to explain to young Germans how their parents' generation had allowed such madness to happen. He never quite succeeded. Alexei Volkov returned to Leningrad and worked as an engineer, rebuilding the city that had been his first battlefield. He never spoke about the war with his children, but sometimes, on quiet nights, his wife would find him standing at the window, staring into the darkness. Franz Muller's mother waited for him to come home until her death in 1962. She kept his room exactly as he had left it, with his school books on the desk and his Hitler Youth uniform hanging in the closet. She never learned that he had died fighting tanks with a weapon designed for grown men. The real cost of Berlin's fall could not be measured in buildings destroyed or lives lost. It was measured in innocence lost, in trust broken, in the realization that civilization was far more fragile than anyone had imagined. The end of everything. The Battle of Berlin ended on May 2, 1945, but its echoes would reverberate through the decades that followed. The city would be divided, rebuilt, reunified, and transformed into a symbol of reconciliation. Museums would be built, monuments erected, and school children would learn about the war as ancient history. But the real lesson of Berlin's fall was not about military strategy or political ideology. It was about the terrible fragility of the world we take for granted, how quickly civilization can collapse when good people do nothing, how easily neighbors can become enemies, how rapidly the unthinkable can become inevitable. The children who grew up in Berlin's bunkers would become the adults who built modern Germany. They would create a society determined never to repeat their parents' mistakes, founded on the principle that democracy requires constant vigilance and active participation. They understood, as perhaps no generation before them had, that freedom is not a natural state but an achievement that must be defended every day. The Soviet soldiers who conquered Berlin would return home to find their own country traumatized by war, led by a dictator who had sacrificed millions of his own people for victory. They had saved the world from one form of tyranny only to discover that tyranny wore many faces. Their children would grow up in a society built on the fiction that the war had been a purely heroic endeavor, with no moral complexity or human cost. For the German civilians who survived the battle, the end of the war was not liberation but the beginning of a different kind of struggle. The struggle to understand how their society had produced such horror, how they had been complicit in their own destruction, how they could build something better from the ruins. Lieutenant Colonel Weber's final report, found in Soviet archives decades later, contained a haunting observation. Asterisk, we fought this war believing that we were defending our homeland, our families, our way of life. But in the end, we discovered that the things we were trying to protect had already been destroyed, not by enemy bombs, but by our own choices, our own silence, our own willingness to believe comfortable lies rather than uncomfortable truths. The mathematical precision of modern warfare had reduced Berlin to rubble with industrial efficiency. But it could not calculate the human cost. The dreams interrupted, the families destroyed, the trust broken between neighbors who had lived side by side for generations. Today, Berlin stands as one of Europe's most vibrant cities, a testament to humanity's ability to rebuild and recover. But beneath the surface, in the memories of the very old and the consciousness of the younger generations, the battle's lessons remain: that democracy is fragile, that silence in the face of evil is complicity, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose courage over comfort. The real battle for Berlin was not fought in April 1945. It was fought in the hearts and minds of people who had to choose, day after day, whether to stand up for what was right or to look the other way. War doesn't end when the guns fall silent. It ends when the last story is told. By connecting with us, we're going to bring you the real insights, the truths others won't show you.